Why do we learn useless things and ignore more practical knowledge? And why do we teach the things that we do? Why do we teach any of it in the worst way possible? The education system is a mess. Welcome back to Achieving Minerva. I'm your host, Sal, and today we're going to continue our discussion about education. Last week I discussed the cost of college and higher education. And I went into detail about that, and I laid out a few alternative paths to gainful employment without a huge financial burden. This week, I want to discuss a different facet of the education system. My other main beef with college, other than the price tag, is the curriculum itself. And this really extends to the majority of public education from kindergarten all the way to graduation day 12 years later. Remember, we're currently telling 17 and 18-year-olds to decide what they want to do for the rest of their life all of a sudden. The story of my beef with the education system begins all the way back in 1700s Prussia. If you recall from history class, yeah, right. Prussia was a region in Europe that covered southern Germany, some of Austria, and much of Eastern Europe. Think of those pictures of the tall hard hat and a flamboyant mustache and a monocle wearing a furry trench coat. That's Prussia. Prussia is basically the father of our current model of education. The model was brought to the United States by a Massachusetts Secretary of Education named Horace Mann in the 1800s. In Prussia, the education system came about because the powers that were at the time needed a secure future in the way of a workforce and security for their empire, aka an army. So their primary mission was not to produce independent thinkers. The goal was not Socrates or Plato. No. They needed loyal and obedient citizens to a republic. Yes, men. One Prussian philosopher wrote, and I'm quoting here, "If you want to influence a person, you must do more than talk to him. You must fashion him. You must fashion him in a way that he simply cannot will otherwise than what you wish him to will." To summarize, we need to teach people what to think, not how to think. Sound familiar? Well, fast forward from 1700s to about 1840, somewhere in there. In the 1840s, the political zeitgeist was tense. Remember that the Civil War began in 1860, so the 1840s were part of the lead up to that. As it pertains to the education reform, though, many immigrants were coming to America. Ireland was in the middle of the Great Famine, which caused many Irish to flee, so they were inundating Ellis Island with a lot of immigration there. And a lot of other immigrants were coming to the United States, and with them, the question of how to integrate them into our society effectively and efficiently. How can we both welcome them and make use of them, help them build a better life by adding them to our workforce? One solution was a tax-supported education system like the Prussians had created. And voila! We adopted a modified Prussian model of education. By 1870, all 37 states at the time had some form of public school system. A tax-supported factory that produced, wait for it, workers for all the other factories. Yay! Fast forward a little bit to post-World War II era, and you'll find the foundation of the current curriculum. In the 1950s and 60s, the content of the education system was overhauled to be a little bit more relevant, but the idea of churning out a workforce stayed mostly intact. Move up all the way to today, and the curriculum has more or less stayed stagnant, which brings us to the meat of the episode. We're going to examine the content of school, what your kids are learning, and spoiler alert, it isn't nothing, as they insist every day when you ask them, but it may as well be to a certain extent. There is no question that effectively functioning in society universally requires some level of literacy and numeracy, reading, writing, and arithmetic, the 3 R's. Those are the bare essentials to function in this modern world. If you want to enhance your existence and usefulness, doing those things above average goes a long way. Things like a better vocabulary to make you sound more intelligent fall into that category. But those foundations are generally accomplished, at least in Western culture, by about the 7th grade or foreign equivalent, which is about 12 years old. But let's look at what happens after that. Starting in 7th grade, most states require you to take a class in language arts or English, math, and history for the next 6 years, 2 more years of middle school and 4 years of high school. And by then, by most measures, you've already been fluent in English or your native tongue for 4 or 5 years. And by 8th grade, you've covered all the mathematics 95% of people will ever use for the rest of their life. When I graduated high school in 2008, I was required to have 4 English, 4 math classes, including geometry, algebra, and either business math or pre-calculus, 3 science classes, including chemistry, biology, and one of your choice, 2 foreign language credits, 4 history credits, 1 health credit, and an array of electives such as public speaking, theater, or more of the core classes. What in the world do I need all of that for if the goal is to create a workforce? Let's start with math. Algebra 1 generally covers 2 variable equations, x plus y equals z, which can be quite useful for a large section of the population. It helps you calculate time to your destination when you're in the car, helps us plug in values to formulas such as compound interest, and then you can work out the basic algebra and so forth. You can also figure out the price of each apple in a pound or something like that. But what good is math after Algebra 1 for most people? Ask someone besides an engineer or a woodworker how many times they've had to find the hypotenuse length or graph a quadratic equation. Odds are there's not going to be very many people other than an engineer. Geometry is used by a pretty small fraction of the workforce. The basics are useful in woodworking, but ask a carpenter about sine angles, cosine angles, tangent angles. You'll find that they probably don't know that much about them. You learn your shapes before you even go to kindergarten. Algebra 2 is mostly a stepping stone to calculus. Things like the quadratic equation and doing multi-factor polynomials. And again, they're useless unless you're an engineer. And other than that, you'll probably never use anything you learn out in Algebra 2. So you're asking yourself, Sal, if not trigonometry or calculus, what should we learn that's more relevant in regards to numeracy and math? Well, here are a few ideas. Personal finance. Literally every person that aims to be an adult needs to understand personal finance beyond income minus expenses equals savings. What about insurance, student loans, buying a car, how to avoid debt and why, interviewing for jobs effectively, organizing a spreadsheet for a budget? Many of these topics, you may have noticed, are why this podcast exists, because it's sorely lacking in school. How about data science and statistics? How many clickbait news articles are out there on Facebook and Twitter about a new study says X% of people need this? What is a median versus an average, and why use one over the other? Why do some statistics report in per capita or per 100,000? How do you make an effective visualization? And what is a data visualization? Or lastly, computer programming. Computers are more or less big calculators, logic machines. You could spend whole semesters on Excel alone just to cover the previous 2 topics. But also, the basics of programming can inform the user on the capabilities, why AI is dangerous, how does Alexa work if it isn't always listening. Math is incredibly useful in everyday life, just not calculus or trigonometry for most people. But understanding some of these other topics in mathematics can really help you navigate the world more efficiently. Stats and personal finance is nearly essential to function. And did you notice that with computer programming and stats, science fits right in most of those topics? you can make a program to chart the position of the sun throughout the year, or a model of wild population dynamics, or a food web. The options are honestly limitless. And speaking of science, what about health and PE? The United States has a huge problem with obesity, and that includes child obesity. Kids are unhealthy, yet instead of teaching the basics of health, we insist that every single hormonal 8th grader be able to serve a volleyball or make a free throw within a 1-hour lesson. In my own gym class, we spent about a week on each game or sport. In the second semester, we focused on, quote, health, and stayed in the classroom mostly. But the content of the classroom was mostly things like the food pyramid, which is now totally wrong, and to say no to drugs thanks to the DARE program. To this day, I have never one time been offered or coerced to consume free drugs other than marijuana, which is pretty much what the DARE insisted would happen to me every single day of high school. Notably, we spent no time on subjects such as why drugs are addictive. I mean, if they are so bad, how does it start? How do you become a drug addict if they are so bad? They have to be enticing on some level. Things like macronutrients and calories in and out, dieting, why mobility and flexibility was important. Mental health wasn't even mentioned, and the words condom or birth control were dirtier than the word fuck. I did a whole episode on physical health, and it boiled down to this: calories in versus calories out, and is balancing how you control weight. Eat whole foods for all the nutrients, get moving, and get your heart rate up. But in school, you could teach the nitty-gritty and really formulate healthy lifestyles for kids. People have sex outside of marriage. That's just a fact. So we need to teach them how to do that safely and responsibly, and remove all the religious shroud and shame from it. And drugs aren't inevitable, but here's why you should avoid them. A full quality health class should take at least a full school year and should include these topics. Mental health should be a solid month of that class at least. If COVID taught us anything, it's that teenagers do have mental health topics they need to learn about. Okay, moving on. English and the humanities. What 16-year-old gets anything meaningful out of books like Tale of Two Cities, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Great Expectations, Hamlet? As a young adult, about 25 years old or so, I did an experiment, and I reread many of the books I was assigned in school. And it turns out many of them are great books. They're classics for a reason. But they are meaningless to a teenager. A teenager is already fluent in English, understands basic grammar, but doesn't yet love reading, but isn't so old that they have to learn to hate it. But we force them to read terrible books, and then they hate reading. Why not Harry Potter, Twilight, Hunger Games, Lord of the Rings, books that notoriously inspire the love of reading in young people? Other than reading English, how can we use language more effectively? How can we have effective and difficult conversations without becoming a heated argument? How can you convince an employer to hire you, to promote you? When is it appropriate to use slang versus a more professional vernacular? What sorts of meetings can just be an email? And why are some in-person meetings actually necessary? Literature is rich, and the English language can be used to make an audience putty in your hands. For example, whether you agree with him or not, President Barack Obama is one of the best wielders of the English language this generation will ever know. Further, there's also news sourcing and the importance of it. What is a good news story? Which is a bad one? Where do you find misinformation and good information? And here's a spoiler: Wikipedia can be a source, and an excellent one when used appropriately. This is perhaps the most important area to be teaching as far as English and language arts at a time like we are in now. Moving on to history and foreign language. History and foreign language are probably the worst examples of subjects that are both useless in the marketplace and also poorly taught. For example, despite my minor in Spanish and my straight A's in Spanish in high school, I would struggle to so much as order food at a restaurant in Latin America or Spain. But as far as the job market goes, I speak English. And as entitled as it sounds, I don't actually need to speak another language because Indeed and LinkedIn can link any employer with a native speaker of pretty much any language on the planet. Data shows that if you don't learn a language in the home, odds are overwhelmingly that you will never be fluent in that language. Immersion in those languages are really the only way to actually learn a language. History is all but completely useless in the job field besides historian, archaeologist, or museum curator. And ask any high school graduate if they can rattle off significant dates or figures. The odds are probably not. History, as a required class right up until the second year of college, is a huge waste of time if school is supposed to be training you for the workforce. No one other than a history teacher needs that much history class in a real practical manner. So why don't we focus on things like civics? In my high school, I spent about 2 weeks talking about this, and that's it. Did you know that in most states in the United States, there are 5 separate people representing you in government? Here in North Carolina, I have 1 House rep and 1 senator at the North Carolina General Assembly. That's the state government. And then I also have 1 congressperson and 2 senators representing me in Washington, for a total of 5 people. I bet I'm the only person I know that can name all 5 of those people. How do laws get made? In my state or in Congress? Are they different? What is the debt ceiling? Why is national debt different than personal debt? Why can't we just print more money? Why do rich people have so much pull in Washington? What's the deal with the Electoral College? What even is that? I could go on and on. We should teach that stuff instead of who sewed the flag or which church Paul Revere put a lantern in. How is that relevant to anything right now? The questions I pose above are steeped in historical origins. And keep in mind that high school graduates are eligible to vote in the next election cycle. They should know how to keep informed and on what to keep informed on so that they can contribute to the running of the country and society in a meaningful manner. Many of you may be sitting there listening and think that I just hate education, and that could not be further from the truth. As much as I think foreign language and history are nearly completely obsolete in the workplace, I think they hold a lot of value. History was by far my least favorite class all through school. It was just so boring. I didn't have that one teacher that just made history come alive like some people are fortunate to have. But while I abhorred history class, I love learning about history. You may recall this whole episode began with a brief history lesson. I also had the good fortune of growing up during a time when the History Channel actually aired history documentaries, and I absolutely ate them up. I spent many of my class periods in history class not listening to my teacher drone on, but reading the books she had on her bookshelf. In 11th grade, I made it through the Quran, 2 volumes of Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, and several journals of past American presidents. I have to say, almost none of the content in those volumes showed up on my homework assignments, except when I referenced them in a paper. Come to find out, the history curriculum is horrendously incomplete. Look no further than the new 1619 series on Hulu right now. Currently, as an adult, I live in part of the United States that is steeped in history, including Native Americans, colonialism, civil wars, a ton of naval warfare, and a whole lot more. I love going to old monuments, talking with natives and their descendants, and reading biographies. I also have the incredible good fortune to have a rich documented family history. I have heirlooms and relics in all of my relatives' houses, including my own. I find cultures and history amazingly fascinating, and there are many parts of history that are useful in navigating current events and the political landscape. Even if history class is useless to most jobs, it can still be incredibly inspiring. I also enjoy trying to learn different languages. I've tried and failed several times to learn a variety of languages. Each time I go through a kick, I do get sidetracked, but I always learn a bunch about a new culture and find their way of life interesting. It inspires me to travel and see the world, and in turn, when I have traveled, I come away wishing that I could communicate on their level, even when they speak perfect English, which many cultures can. All of these topics I proposed and picked apart help mold thinkers instead of drones. We are at a time in our collective history when all of human knowledge is available in less than 10 seconds, and it's almost always in your pocket. We shouldn't be teaching what to think because you can find what to think on any topic you can imagine. Instead, we need to give the new generations the tools to find that knowledge, how to think. The powers that be don't really want that. A famous man once said, "How fortunate for our leaders that men don't think." Unfortunately, that particular man went on to be probably the most hated man in history, and for good reason. It was Adolf Hitler. But his statement is unfortunately kind of true. Leaders don't want thinkers, they want sheep. We need to make thinkers. Imagine if we had a generation grow up with the information we have already. What a world they could create. As a big example, the COVID epidemic put all of the really smart biomedical engineers and focused them on one thing, and that was to rid us of this virus. And people were scared of the vaccine because it happened so quick, but just think of how many smart people took 50 years of vaccine knowledge and research and just all were focused on one single problem to solve. And it happened within 8 months. Imagine what else we could come up with if that many smart people came together to focus all the problems. If you would like to learn more about the current state of education and perhaps a brilliant proposal for the future, I recommend the book The One World Schoolhouse by Salman Khan. Sal Khan is the founder of Khan Academy, which is an online platform with 100% free education courses that are totally online. I highly recommend the online resource, but also his book. Sal also gave an interview on a podcast I highly recommend called People I Mostly Admire, which is a child of the Freakonomics podcast. Until next time, please find us on Twitter. We are at Minerva_fire. We also have a website. Please tell your friends, leave us a rating and a comment, and we're also on YouTube. Tell everybody so that we can all achieve Minerva together.